All right. It's been asked and requested and asked again, but I was busy basking in the glory of our great governor bringing all of this love and affection down on my home state of Minnesota. I just wanted a little bit of moment to, soak it in and enjoy it. But before it gets too hairy, I'll talk about Harris. This week's political figure is Kamala Harris, if you hadn't picked up on that already. And before we get into it, she has a painfully extensive career. She's done a lot. Researching for this was almost as bad or worse as some of those 90-year-old assholes who never leave Congress and have been there their whole life. She's just done a lot in a lot less time, and I do not have the time or likely brain power to go in depth on all of it. So I'm gonna do my best to give balanced highlights that, in my opinion, paint kind of the best picture of who Kamala is as a candidate. Kamala Harris was born October 20th, 1964 in Oakland, California. Her mom was an immigrant from India, making her Indian. Her dad was a black immigrant from Jamaica, making her, and get this, because it is real complicated, black. Did you know people could be like two things? It's just crazy times we're living in. Now, her parents, super smart. Her mom was a researcher studying endocrinology, like 40 years of research led to advancements in understanding and treating breast cancer. Her dad was an economist and the first black scholar to get tenure at Stanford School of Economics. Kamala's like the kid of those people who didn't end up having kids at the beginning of Idiocracy. Anyway, her parents ended up in Berkeley because, they're fucking smart, and Kamala ended up having to be bused to a desegregated school because America sucked. Anyway, her parents ended up getting divorced. Her mom moved to Canada. She ended up going back and forth between Canada and California for a good portion of her childhood. She attended Vanier College in Montreal and then Howard University in Washington, D.C. After getting a bachelor's in political science and economics, she went to the University of California School of Law to get her Juris Doctor. She started her career as a deputy district attorney in Alameda, California. Then in 1994, her at-the-time boyfriend, Willie Brown, appointed her to the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board. That's where conservatives came up with those really clever jokes about how, she slept her way to the top, which, don't get me wrong, it was definitely nepotism, which I thought conservatives loved, looking at the Trump administration. Maybe it was just too mild a nepotism. I know the Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board is definitely the height of political aspirations, but maybe it wasn't enough nepotism because it was just the guy she was dating who gave her the position and not her dad who gave it to her because it's her dad and also he wants to sleep with her. In 1998, she was recruited as San Francisco's assistant district attorney, and in 2002, she ran for district attorney of San Francisco herself. And she won, and this is the part of the video where everybody who pearl clutches to criticisms of Kamala is gonna start choking themselves like they've got an auto-asphyxiation king. But I'm sorry, our criminal justice system is corrupt and broken, as I think we can all agree, and so are the people who make it work. We can't abandon those principles simply because somebody we like was a part of it. Furthermore, we should be critical of our elected officials, especially the ones that we like. All right, deep breaths, let's get into it. As district attorney of San Francisco, she did some shitty prosecutor stuff, like secured over 1,900 low-level marijuana convictions. I know a bunch of you are like, well, it was the law, she was just doing her job. And yeah, that's the excuse cops always use to do shit that they shouldn't be doing. She prosecuted more than her predecessor, and her successor expunged all marijuana charges for everybody going back to 1975. She didn't have to do it, she chose to. To be fair, very few of those convictions resulted in jail time, and most of the jail time was also tied in with other crimes. But it was still criminal convictions that resulted in a criminal record that negatively affected many people's lives that she didn't have to prosecute on something that shouldn't have been criminalized. On top of that, later in her career as Attorney General, she'd fight against the decriminalization of marijuana. Not a great fucking look. She also pushed to increase bail for criminal defendants in gun-related crimes, which is also a just super fucked thing to do. But that said, she also did some really great things. She supported protections from law enforcement and criminal prosecution for undocumented immigrants, which is awesome. She created a program called Back on Track that helped low-level drug offenders finish school or get a GED. It lowered recidivism rates to 10% versus 53% that went to prison. Program she would go on to expand when she would become Attorney General of California as well, which is, again, awesome. She also promised when campaigning for district attorney to never seek the death penalty, and she kept that promise. So she definitely instituted some progressive reform and definitely could have been considered a progressive prosecutor as district attorney of San Francisco. And then she ran for Attorney General of California and won, and did that less so. Because, for example, well, she may have not have been a fan of the death penalty. As Attorney General, she had the ability to make sure that California's death penalty laws weren't enforced, and she said she wouldn't get in the way of California carrying out executions. Once again, she's just doing her job, but she did that selectively because she chose not to enforce Prop 8, which banned and criminalized gay marriage in the state, which again, great thing. I'm glad she chose not to enforce that, but again, it's a little picky-choosy here. Her office also tried to disobey and fight the Supreme Court when it ruled that California's prisons were so overcrowded it constituted cruel and unusual punishment and they needed to release non-violent offenders. And her office's argument for why they couldn't abide by the order and release the prisoners was that they needed slave labor. No joke, they said releasing them would make the prisons understaffed. Now, Kamala's official defense for this was that she didn't realize her office was doing that. You know, big place, lots of faces. Which, if true, also not great. And her office, you know, not her, 'cause she didn't know what was going on, fought to keep people who'd been proven wrongfully convicted in prison. Her office tried to argue that the guy who was wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit couldn't be released from prison because he didn't file some paperwork on time. She also went a little overboard, backing the blue, you know, covering for corrupt cops. Consistently resisted efforts to investigate police shootings. She fought against a police accountability bill that would have required the immediate investigation of police killings. Once she even defended a state prosecutor for falsifying a confession and using it to threaten a defendant with life in prison to try to get a conviction. And then when the judge threw the indictment out, because you know that shit's super illegal and super fucked up, her office appealed it, saying that the misconduct wasn't that big of a deal because it wasn't like there was any physical violence involved. Again, not something she was probably personally involved with, but it happened on her watch, and she had the ability to create a structure and environment of reform, and she didn't. But again, she did some amazing things as Attorney General as well. Like, she put her boot in the ass of big business left and right. She got major tech companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook to increase their transparency on their privacy policies on their apps. She got almost $60 million in settlements out of Comcast for violating their customers' privacy. She got a bunch of multi-million-dollar settlements from oil companies for not properly monitoring their hazardous waste. And she got almost $15 billion out of Volkswagen for cheating on emissions testing. Now, that's the kind of shit that prosecutors should be prosecuting. She also worked with officials in Mexico to crack down on gangs, human, and drug trafficking. Also did a lot of work to fight sex trafficking, and her efforts included the death of Backpage, may it rest in peace. Well, that's cool, although she also fought the decriminalization of sex work, which is less cool. Anyway, she had an incredibly long and accomplished career as a prosecutor, did some amazing things, but she was also a prosecutor and a cog in a broken machine, and you know, in the words of pissed off bartender, yeehaw, fuck the law. But we gotta keep her moving, because her career doesn't end there, and in 2016, she ran for and won a seat as a U.S. Senator from California. Senator, she moved back to being a bit more progressive than she was as a prosecutor, which is promising. Since we've been talking criminal justice, she's been fairly pro-criminal justice reform as a senator. She co-sponsored a bill to ban the death penalty in 2019, didn't pass. She supported the First Step program to reduce recidivism. She supported expanding more early release programs, especially through COVID. She advocated for the Minnesota Freedom Fund that helped secure bail for people arrested during the George Floyd protests. As a senator, she did finally support legislation that would have decriminalized cannabis on a federal level. Took her long enough, but you know, she got there. She publicly opposed private prisons. So credit where it's due, she's definitely gotten better on support of criminal justice reform. I just wish she had done it when it didn't feel like it was so convenient. She's been a pretty big advocate for education. She supports free college tuition for kids whose families make under $125,000 a year. She supports some student loan forgiveness. She's also like really obsessed with truancy. It's a weird thing, goes way back to her prosecutor days. I'm not going to get into it. She's been pretty supportive of immigration reform, supporting the DREAM Act and Dreamers. Honestly, being an advocate for immigrants has really been a common thread through her entire career, even as she was a prosecutor. She was also a vocal opponent of Trump's Muslim bans and things like that. Through the Senate, she continued her advocating for internet privacy and net neutrality. She's been a strong supporter of LGBTQ rights, of voting rights. Being a former prosecutor, she has been a bulldog in Senate hearings, and she was one of the people who helped make Brett Kavanaugh cry, which is just like 100 bonus points right there. She also supports higher taxes on the wealthy, and a huge supporter of women's healthcare rights and bodily autonomy. Just all around, a fairly progressive voting record. Honestly, she was pretty hands-on for a first-year senator that only served 4 of her 6 years in the Senate. Because obviously in 2020, she was selected as Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate. Since then, she has been serving as vice president, and vice presidents don't do a whole lot, but she's done a lot compared to what most vice presidents do. She's cast more tie-breaking votes in the Senate than any other vice president in history, and a lot of those votes have been crucial in the legislative success of the Biden-Harris administration. She was the 3rd vice president and the first woman, obviously, to serve as acting president under the 3rd section of the 25th Amendment when Joe Biden was having a colonoscopy. She's been pretty active in the administration's foreign diplomacy, meeting with world leaders, but I think her biggest role as VP has been her role in immigration, meeting with Mexican officials and working on identifying and addressing the root causes of migration, figuring out positive ways to address cartels, human and drug trafficking, not telling Mexico that they were going to pay for a pointless wall that was never going to get built that they were never actually going to pay for. It's all the type of boring behind the scenes stuff that has real impact on addressing the problems that we all, hear people loudly crying about but not actually doing anything to solve. That brings us to her running for president. She has the resume. There is no two questions questions about it. She is well qualified. She served in all three branches of government. She has a diverse background. She's used her time in the Senate and as vice president wisely to gain foreign policy experience and develop relationships with foreign leaders and diplomats. She's supporting a lot of the right things when it comes to education, healthcare, taxing billionaires, you know, not letting the government look over your OBGYN shoulder. And as much as I am critical of her time as a prosecutor, I think that experience translates really well to the executive office of the United States. Because a prosecutor's job is to leverage whatever resources are at their disposal to get the best outcomes in tough negotiations for the entity that they represent. And that's what you want in a president when they're trying to get legislation passed and convince other world leaders to get on board with shit. That sort of experience, though, makes her so she's not the best at interviews and press conferences. She gets fucking awkward because I don't think she's used to being on the vulnerable receiving end of questioning. That sort of awkwardness, I think, is what tanked her Democratic nomination bid back in 2020, which is probably the reason she's tried to limit the amount of press conferences and interviews she's done so far. And now she's agreeing to do some more. Don't be surprised when you see some of that come back out again. And to be clear, I don't think that's a weakness of her doing her job. I just think that's a weakness of appeal to people. But out of all of that, in the end, we know that she picked Tim Walz as her VP, so clearly she's got some pretty damn good judgment. And you know, she's not like 176 like Donald Trump or every other candidate we've had for a long time. So that's also bonus points. There you have it, the history of Harris, or at least as much as I could cram in on a video that I got started on way too late today. Hopefully that makes you a little bit more informed and a little bit more excited to vote for Kamala and Tim come November.